In this Eastertide, our lectionary gives us lots of opportunities to learn about the life of the early church and how they might have responded to the good news of the resurrection. In the story that we'll read this morning from the Gospel of Luke, there's a beautiful story about two disciples. Many have found a mirror of their own faith journey in this story. Two disciples who are on a journey from Jerusalem to Emmaus on the afternoon of Resurrection Day. It has all the ingredients of a great drama: emotion, movement, suspense, revelation, reaction. Hear these words from Luke chapter 24, 13 through 35. Now on that same day, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem, and talking with each other about all these things that had happened. While they were talking and discussing, Jesus himself came near and went with them, but their eyes were kept from recognizing him. And he said to them, "What are you discussing with each other while you walk along?" They stood still, looking sad. Then one of them, whose name was Cleopas, answered him, "Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who doesn't know the things that have taken place there in these days?" He asked them, "What things?" They replied, "The things about Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and leaders handed him over to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. Yes, and besides all this, it's now the 3rd day since these things took place. Moreover, some women of our group astounded us. They were at the tomb early this morning, and when they didn't find his body there, they came back and told us that they had indeed seen a vision of angels who said that he was alive. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they didn't see him." Then he said to them, "Oh, how foolish you are, and how slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have declared. Was it not necessary that the Messiah should suffer these things and then enter into his glory?" Then beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them the things about himself in all the scriptures. As they came near the village to which they were going, he walked ahead as if he were going on. But they urged him strongly, saying, "Stay with us, because it's almost evening and the day is now nearly over." So he went in to stay with them. And when he was at the table with them, he took bread, blessed it, and broke it, and gave it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. They said to each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he was talking to us on the road, while he was opening the scriptures to us?" That same hour they got up and returned to Jerusalem, and they found the 11 and their companions gathered there together. They were saying, "The Lord has risen indeed, and he has appeared to Simon." Then they told what had happened on the road and how he had been made known to them in the breaking of the bread. Friends, this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. A number of years ago, I had the opportunity to participate in a 3-day renewal weekend. There are many such weekends that go by a variety of names, depending on the tradition from which they emerge. The original began in Spain, started by the Roman Catholic Church in the 1940s. It was named Cursillo, which is Spanish for a short course. In other words, a short course in faith. Since then, other traditions have adapted the model to use as a way to introduce or to renew faith to community members. I participated in an ecumenical version of the weekend called Tres Dias, 3 days. There's a Presbyterian version called the Great Banquet. I like the Methodist name the best, Walk to Emmaus. It is, of course, named for the story that we've just heard from Luke's gospel, the story of disciples whose eyes are opened and lives transformed. The two disciples, one named Cleopas, the other unnamed, Some scholars think it might have been a married couple. Journey from Jerusalem to Emmaus in a bit of a fog. One author writes that they are on the road of broken dreams. They're beaten down from the recent events of Jesus' arrest, trial, suffering, and crucifixion. News had circulated that when women had gone to the tomb early that morning to anoint the body of Jesus, there was no body there. No one really knew what was going on. They continued to walk along, unsure of what all this meant. They had no idea what it meant for their faith, what it meant for their life moving forward. They had imagined that Jesus, the promised Messiah, would come and liberate them from Roman occupation, liberate God's people once again, just as God had done for the Israelites under Pharaoh's rule, a story they had just relived during the Passover Seder a few days prior. But now all seemed lost. But Jesus joined them in their journey, in their walk. They couldn't see him for who he really was, just perhaps as they hadn't truly understood who he was as their Messiah. What kept them from recognizing him? Was Jesus' resurrection body that different? Did he somehow keep his identity hidden from them intentionally? Did their grief and their confusion keep them from being able to see clearly? We don't really know. What does seem clear is that Luke wanted the church to hear that their eyes were opened and their faith was renewed through the sharing of word and sacrament. Jesus interpreted the Hebrew scriptures to them, revealing himself as a long-awaited Messiah whose suffering and whose death would indeed free God's people and usher in a new creation. Jesus broke bread with them, and in that moment of communion, truly welcomed them into communion with the living God. Scholar N.T. Wright suggests that this story from Luke is meant to recall the very first meal of the Bible. You remember when Adam and Eve ate of the forbidden fruit and their eyes were opened? That act of disobedience represented humanity's and creation's plunge into brokenness and sin and death. However, the meal at Emmaus, it represents the renewal of creation and God's redemption of creation and humanity through the defeat of sin and death at the cross and the empty tomb. Eyes again are opened, and the reality of the living Christ is experienced anew. So I wonder how God wants to open our eyes today. And once our eyes are opened, I wonder how God might call us to respond. On this Earth Care Sunday, I've been thinking about creation and the wonder and beauty of the world that God's entrusted to our care. The psalmist declares that the earth is the Lord's and all that is in it. The Apostle Paul wrote that God's glory and majesty have been revealed to us from the very beginning through the things that God has made. It doesn't mean that we worship the things of earth, the things that are created, but we see the presence of a good and gracious and loving God in the gifts of creation. Who doesn't enjoy a beautiful sunset? Whether it's from our own Lake Norman, or from the beach, or with our Kenya partners, or with our Nicaragua partners. All around the world, there's amazing beauty in the world that God has made and entrusted to our care. Our appreciation of that beauty is an opportunity to see God's presence and to give thanks to God and to renew our commitment to answer the call to care for creation, to preserve it for generations to come. But that's not the only place where our eyes can be opened, where we can experience the living God. We also have our eyes open when we gather in spaces like this in our community, when we gather for fellowship and worship and learning and service. when we sit down and break bread together and engage in meaningful conversation, when we share our hearts with one another and respect one another enough to consider different ways of thinking than our own, when we serve in mission together side by side, building a habitat house, serving a warm meal, visiting a neighbor, when we lift our voices in praise to God, when we let go of our own pride and arrogance enough to humble ourselves, as the Apostle Paul writes, to seek the mind of Christ, we actually experience the presence of the living Christ here in the body. Helen Hayes, the famous actress of stage and screen, in her autobiography, This I Believe, wrote about her struggle with faith following the loss of her daughter to polio. I cut God out of my life the day my daughter died, she wrote, and I didn't have the nerve or desire to ask him back into my life again. And yet I went to my church in New York City and watched the people come and go, solemn laborers with tired looks on their faces and older women with gnarled hands. And then one day I discovered that it had happened. Restoration of my faith and a reunion with God. I had seen all those people whom life had knocked around coming into the church looking for something and finding someone. And suddenly I was one of them, and I experienced a flood of compassion, a release from my grief and emptiness. And I've never since felt separated from the love of God. Speaking of compassion, that quality that invites us to walk alongside others in their moments of suffering and struggle. In our Matthew 25 initiative, we remember that we can experience the presence of Jesus in the suffering, the marginalized, the impoverished, the sick, the destitute. When we serve our neighbors in need, our eyes are opened anew to the presence of the living Christ. And having our eyes opened invites us to live into this new creation with all of the wonder and hope and possibility that resurrection life offers. This past week, I was returning to the house after running an errand, and I noticed something in our driveway. Yes, I'm telling the story, Jenny, sorry. Upon closer inspection, I realized that there was a little dead bunny rabbit. I thought it perhaps was a gift left by our cat, Spot. But on closer inspection, I realized that I had backed over the bunny when I'd left the driveway earlier. I was heartbroken. I mean, it's a little rabbit, but it's still so unnecessary. It was an accident, of course, nothing intentional or malicious. I never knew that rabbits hid behind parked cars, and I'm sure that rabbit didn't know that that tire was about to move and back over it. But ever since then, I've been thinking about those situations in our world when our eyes are suddenly open to the reality of life and death, moving us from blindness to sight, and how the trajectory of our faith always pushes us towards life, from death to life, from darkness to light, from despair to hope, from injustice to justice, toward renewal, restoration, reconciliation, resurrection. With eyes opened, aren't we called to a new way of being in the world? I mean, now that I know that little bunnies hide behind parked cars, maybe I can take a few moments to look before I back out next time. Now that I know that improving a canopy can help us and the earth in a multitude of ways, shouldn't I consider planting some trees? Now that I know there's an island of plastic floating in our oceans from discarded bags and containers, shouldn't I consider reducing my use of bags and single-use plastic? Now that I know that certain words and actions can cause people harm and wound them, shouldn't I consider alternative ways of speaking and interacting with others? Now that I know that some of our policies and ways of living are actually harmful to our neighbors, shouldn't I work to try and change these policies so that the abundant life Jesus came to give can be freely enjoyed by all? Friends, having our eyes opened to the presence of the living Christ is a beautiful thing, and it calls us to a new way of being in this new creation. I was reminded of the beautiful old hymn, "Open My Eyes That I May See," by Clara Scott. If you know it, will you sing the chorus with me? Silently now I wait for thee, ready, my God, thy will to see. Open my eyes, illumine me, Spirit divine. In the various verses of the hymn, Miss Scott moves from open eyes to open ears to open mouth to open heart, a total transformation of the body of life and the life of life brought on by the revelation of God's living and loving presence. The disciples of Emmaus, with eyes opened anew, didn't tarry or hesitate. The text says at that same hour they got up and they went back to Jerusalem and shared the good news of their experience. May our response be as quick and as decisive as we meet the risen Christ in all of our journeys, and having eyes opened anew, may we also be open to how God would call us to new ways of being God's faithful people in the world. To God be the glory. Amen.